Chapter 10. Seek and Find. For a long moment he just stood there, wrapped in darkness. His breath echoed heavily in his ears, and he was hardly able to think. He half expected the door to open up behind him, and for all the attendants and the bald, menacing lesser seeker to come in and pull him out. Perhaps the exile girl would find a way in and slit his throat in the darkness. But time passed, and none of those things happened. More time passed, and his breathing slowed, and he found himself able to think again. He was through the seventh door. The seeker was here. The seeker must be here. Hello? His voice came back to him in hollow echoes, and he realized that he wasn't in a room but in a long passageway. As his eyes adjusted to the black, he also began to realize that he wasn't in total darkness. He could vaguely make out a light far away, in the distance in front of him. He began to move cautiously toward the light, both hands stretched out before him, inching ahead one step at a time. With each step, the light grew brighter, and soon he was able to lower his hands. A little farther along, he found that he was indeed in a long passageway, a downward-sloping half-circle made of cobblestone walls. The floor was nothing but smooth, hard-packed dirt, and his simple common's boots left little impression on it. Down the passage he went, until he could make out the light source, a guttering, shifting torch held in an iron wall bracket. Beyond it, the passageway curved to the right and continued down. The darkness began to close in on him again as he left the torch behind. This was a message from the Seekers. There was some sort of religious dogma here, he knew, about seeking the truth of light even in the dark when all seems lost. But such contemplations were lost on him. All he was worried about was tripping over actual stumbling blocks, not metaphorical ones. The passage continued to curve right and downward, and he realized he would soon be directly beneath the cathedral itself. Another light became visible in the distance, and he moved toward it, faster this time, and just beyond it found a simple wooden door. A coin lay at his feet, and he bent to pick it up. But before he touched it, he noticed something odd. There were 6 small indentations in the floor that looked too perfectly spaced to be there by coincidence. Slowly, he pulled the other 6 coins out and placed them, one by one, in the holes, which, he was unsurprised to find, fit the coins perfectly. As soon as his hand left the metal of the final coin, there was a click from above where he had knelt. He stood, reached out, and pulled on the metal ring of the door, which swung open toward him on silent, oiled hinges. Beyond it was what looked like an anteroom, where a number of figures in the pure black cloaks of searchers, the novice level of seekers, were lighting rows of candles. The room was large and perfectly circular. He stepped inside, and as he did, the searchers stopped what they were doing and turned to look at him, their faces concealed by the tall hoods of their robes. For a long moment, he stood in the doorway, unsure of what to do next. The room contained 3 doors aside from the one he'd just come through, 2 at right angles to him, and the third directly across the circle of candles. In the end, it was the 3rd door that opened, breaking the silence, and through it came 3 men, 2 in silver armor outlined in gold, and a 3rd in robes, an unnatural, snowy white, completely out of place in this dark, underground chamber. The 2 in armor were large and moved with the fluid motions of practiced soldiers, while the 3rd was elderly, with long, flowing hair almost as white as his robes, tied neatly behind his head. Ornate makeup and tattoos covered his face, bright golden sunbursts, the all-seeing eye etched in silver upon his forehead, and various 7-pointed stars on his neck, cheeks, and in the hollow of his throat. Both of his hands, held together in front of him, bore twisting circles of black briars. "Good evening, my son," the man in white said. "I was informed that we had a very promising child of the light seeking us along the path, but I am—" The man trailed off as the prince stepped forward, coming into the full light of the candles, breaking the seeker out of the traditional welcome. "I am no child of the light, seeker," the prince said, lowering the hood of his cloak. "I am a child of the Empress." Immediately, the silence in the room went from contemplative to deadly. The welcoming, fatherly expression on the seeker's face curdled, and one of the searchers was startled so badly that he dropped his metal candle lighter, which crashed to the ground with a hollow, brassy sound that echoed through the circular room. Good evening, my prince," the seeker said. He had regained his composure and spoke with soft assurance, but he was staring at the prince so intensely a lesser man would be cowed. The prince knew immediately that this was not a man who was used to being commanded, and certainly not one used to being taken by surprise. He felt himself beginning to form an apology, and then realized he was no longer with the exiles. He was one of the children, and would again be given the respect he deserved. There was no need to apologize or to explain himself here. A sick feeling kindled in the pit of his stomach, which he dismissed as hunger. "We need to speak, Seeker," the prince said, "and I will need proper clothing. I prefer black robes as befitting my office." The Seeker bowed his head, and the prince felt a brief flash of amusement as both guards exchanged a shock glance at such deference. "Indeed, my prince. Please, follow me." The Seeker turned, and as he did, the prince noticed his hands make a small motion toward one of the guards, no doubt telling him to fetch the robes. The guard stepped up to either side of the Seeker, and once the old man had passed through the door, they waited for the prince to enter as well. A voice in the back of the prince's head told him not to enter, but he ignored it. Exiles listened to such voices. Princes, as his siblings had often told him, did not. He found himself in a large, well-lit office. The Seeker moved across the room and sat behind a large desk, then motioned for the prince to take the seat opposite. The prince crossed the room, and as he did, his eyes fell on a small dagger in a rack on the desk, no doubt used as a letter opener. It was heavily gilded and gem-encrusted, but sharp and serviceable. He sat in the chair to which the Seeker had motioned, and wondered idly why he did not feel relieved. He looked up into the eyes of the Seeker and told himself that he was being foolish. Here he was in the lair of a Seeker. As a child of the Empress, this was one of the safest places he could find himself. All who lived and worked here were sworn to obey his smallest whim. "Seeker, I will need pen and paper immediately. I must send a message to my mother." "Indeed, my prince," the Seeker said, inclining his white head. "I will send for my scribe immediately. But first, wouldn't you like refreshment? You look very worn." The Seeker motioned to the guards, of which the prince realized there was now only one. Where had the other gone? Hopefully to fetch him his robes. They would no doubt be searcher robes, but as long as they were not this common's filth, they would be serviceable. The remaining guard poured 2 cups of blood-red wine and handed them to the Seeker, who then offered one to the prince. The prince took it but did not drink. He didn't have much of a head for wine, and he needed to keep his wits. "Your scribe is competent, I am sure, but this message I must write myself. There has been treason in the Empire, and I must inform both the Empress and you of the events of the past few weeks." "Indeed, my prince," the Seeker repeated, though he made no motion to do anything. A long moment passed wherein the prince and the Seeker simply looked at each other. A terrible foreboding swept over the prince. A door to his left opened, and the second guard re-entered. He was now accompanied by 4 others. "I gave you an order, Seeker," the prince said, trying to remain calm. "Yes, but you see, another order came this morning, borne by the Empress's hand." The Seeker's eyes seemed to glow red in the reflected light of the candles that lit the room. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. "What were these orders?" the prince asked. He moved a hand across the table to grasp his cup, which lay next to the sharp, dagger-like letter opener. The Seeker smiled sadly. "Please, my son, do not attempt to make this more difficult than it has to be." 2 pairs of rough hands seized him by the shoulders, and he grabbed the dagger, but a third pair grabbed it and took it from him as easily as if he had been an infant. "Unhand me!" He was pulled out of the chair and onto his feet. His hands were tied behind him, and a rough cloth was forced between his teeth and tied around his head. "Hold him, but do not damage him," the Seeker said, his brow furrowed in something akin to disappointment. "He must remain unharmed until one of the children arrives to claim him." The prince tried to question the Seeker once more, but all that came out was a muffled shout around the choking gag. "Hush, hush. I will let you know your fate, as it is clear now that you will be unable to escape. When news reached the Empress that you had survived the death watch not once but twice, she sent word to the Seekers that you were to be apprehended and held until one of the children themselves could come and claim you." The prince's knees went weak, and only the men gripping him kept him standing. It was true. All of it was true. "You seem surprised," the Seeker said, examining him as if he were nothing more than an interesting insect specimen squirming under his gaze. The prince twisted his head violently, and to his surprise the gag slipped. He spat out the cloth and pinned the Seeker with his gaze. "You are sworn to obey me. I am a child of the Empress. I am the Prince of Ravens, the Lord of the 7th Principality, and I demand your respect." He was vaguely surprised by his own outburst, which had been so violent that his throat felt raw. He didn't know what was happening. This couldn't be. Not here. No, this couldn't be happening here. This was a safe place, safe because he was the Prince of Ravens. He was. I must send a letter to my mother, Seeker, he babbled on, hardly conscious of what he was saying now, slowly losing all sense of dignity and pride, his voice turning from command to desperate plea. I am to receive my inheritance. There has been a misunderstanding. One of my brothers or sisters, the other children, they have misinformed you. They were told to do so by my mother. You cannot hold me, Seeker. I must be free to claim what is rightfully mine. It is what my mother expects of me. The Seeker watched him with an impassive face and a terrifying look of pity. The prince, unable to do anything else, found himself wrestling against the grip of the guards, but their hands were strong, and he was weak from the journey through the mountains. Did you truly think, the Seeker said, that this was all a test? The prince let out a low moan, and then nodded, unable to speak. Yes, a test. That was it. He had figured it out. Now they would see. They would understand that he was worthy after all, that he was destined to be a true son of the Empress, one that she could be proud of, one that she would love as much as she loved her other children. But the Seeker was shaking his head, and the look of pity was turning to something else, changing to laughter. Oh no, I'm sorry, I shouldn't laugh. But really, Empress forfend, that is quite an interesting deduction to make from 2 attempted murders. Oh my, yes. Oh, and all this time they've been looking for you in the north, thinking you would attempt to seek help from those you knew in Lucien. But no, you came south in an attempt to find a Seeker, and in doing so delivered yourself up for slaughter. Be silent! Rage ignited his blood, and soon the strong guards could barely hold him. He'd become an animal in a trap, and in his despair, in his descent into madness, he was granted the strength of desperation. You will release me now, he roared, spittle flying from his mouth and his eyes rolling madly in his head. Calm him, the Seeker said, a tinge of apprehension coloring his voice. 2 more guards came forward and grabbed him, and soon the prince found himself pinned to the floor, unable to move a single limb no matter how hard he tried. He was powerless, and when he realized it, the rage disappeared and his mind went blank. Time seemed to slow. No thoughts went through his mind, nothing but vague sensations. Impressions of the room, the high ceiling held with wooden beams, the smell of incense beneath the garlic and onions smell of the guards holding him, the color of the Seeker's white robes and the brightness of the swirling religious markings. Take him away, the Seeker said. Hold him and chain him. Let no one near him bearing any kind of weapon. Let no one enter his cell, and feed him only as much as will keep him alive. We must not lose him, and we must not let him use his power. He, while an exiled prince, is still a prince, and one of the 7 godheads, until such time as the Empress removes his blessing. He may appear powerless, but he is not. Take every precaution lest ye wish to test the strength of our Empress's blood. He made a motion over the prince's shoulder, and a bag was thrust over the prince's head. Something hard and solid struck him, and he knew no more.